In 1915, the mouth of Ship Creek holds no permanent residents, one unnamed creek, and a stand of spruce where no road, no rail line, and no town yet exists. Within 45 years, that same mud flat is the largest city in the American North. By the early 2020s, it holds close to 289,000 people, nearly 4 in every 10 Alaskans, and it has lost population for 7 consecutive years, its working-age residents leaving faster than anywhere else in the state. The city had not been emptied by a flood, or a fire, or any single event a historian could point to. It had simply run out of the thing it was built on. And it had been built and rebuilt 4 separate times, on a railroad, on a war, and on a field of oil, each of them spent. Chapter 1. The Anchorage. The place itself begins with a correction. Most of the world hears Alaska and pictures the Arctic, ice shelves, the midnight sun, a coastline scraped bare by permafrost. Anchorage sits at 61 degrees north, more than 300 miles below the Arctic Circle, in the belt of the continent that geographers call subarctic, and that no atlas would mark as polar. It is closer to Seattle than to Utqiagvik. The mountains here are green in July, not white. This is the American North, not the American Arctic, and the distinction is not cosmetic. It is the reason anything could be built here at all. What made this particular stretch of shoreline usable was not climate. It was water arranged in a specific and unrepeatable way. At the mouth of Ship Creek, fresh water runs down off the Chugach Mountains and meets the salt water of Cook Inlet in a pocket, sheltered enough to hold a vessel steady. The mountains rise almost directly from the tide line, a wall of rock standing between the inlet and the interior, and at their base, the creek carved the one gap where ships could sit, land could be worked, and people could stay. Not a harbor built by engineers, a harbor found. Beside it runs Turnagain Arm, and Turnagain Arm keeps a secret most cities never have to reckon with. Its tides are among the largest in North America, a range that reaches 40 feet between low and high, second on the continent only to the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. Twice in a day, the water leaves the flats entirely, pulling back far enough to expose miles of gray mud that look, from a distance, like solid ground. It is not solid ground. It has swallowed moose, trapped hikers who mistook it for a shortcut, hardened suddenly enough to earn its own reputation among rescue crews. And twice in a day, the water comes back. It does not come back the way tides come back elsewhere, creeping in over hours. It comes back as a wave. A bore tide forms at the mouth of the arm and travels up the flats as a single standing wall of water, moving at 5 to 6 miles an hour, visible from a mile off, as a line of white breaking across brown mud. Stand on the flats at low tide, and you would see it arrive. Not a rising, an arrival. And in minutes, the ground you were standing on is gone, replaced by moving current. The bore tide has been surfed. It has been photographed from bridges. It has never, in the way of things that predate cities, needed anyone's permission. This is what Anchorage means before it means anything else. A place for a ship to hold. Not a metaphorical wall of water, an actual one. Twice a day. Older than any settlement that would eventually take the word as its name. The tide was here before the railroad. It was here before the war. It was here before the oil. It will be here after all 3 are spent, indifferent to what gets built on the mud flats above its reach, and it is the last thing that will still be here when the rest is gone. But in 1915, none of that is a metaphor yet. It is simply geography. A creek, a mountain wall, a sheltered pocket of water at 61 degrees north. Waiting for someone in Washington to look at a map and decide it was worth something. That decision is less than a year away, and it does not come from a settler, a prospector, or a homesteader with a claim staked on the flats. It comes from a railroad survey, a signature, and a choice made thousands of miles away by people who had never stood on this ground at all. Chapter 2. The Railroad Chooses the Ground. The signature comes first. In March 1914, Congress passes the Alaska Railroad Act, authorizing President Woodrow Wilson to build a government-owned line from an ice-free port on the coast to the coal seams and gold country of the interior. The budget is capped at $35 million. No route is fixed. No town exists to receive it. The line is to be public because no private company will build it. The interior holds coal in the Matanuska fields and gold beyond, but the wealth is stranded, worthless without rails to a harbor that does not freeze, and no railroad man will lay track across a territory that cannot promise a return. So the federal government becomes the builder itself. It commits $35 million to a territory of a few tens of thousands of people, an extraordinary sum poured toward ground most of the country will never see. The coal needs the port. The port needs the rails. The rails need a place to begin. Wilson was a Virginia-born academic who had spent a decade as a university president and a reform governor before the presidency, a man who had never seen Cook Inlet and never would. He would decide the fate of a subarctic mudflat from a desk in Washington. In April 1915, he chooses the western route through the Susitna Valley, and the choice is made on paper, thousands of miles from the ground it concerns. The mouth of Ship Creek, empty the year before, becomes headquarters overnight. What follows is not settlement. It is combustion. Within weeks, a construction camp of more than 2,000 people rises on the mudflats. A population larger than most incorporated towns in the territory assembled in a season. It has restaurants, it has barbershops and laundries. It has 2 tent movie theaters, a newspaper, and 2 lawyers. All of it canvas and green lumber, all of it standing in creek mud that turns to a churn of boot tracks with every tide and rain. A city complete in function, absent in law. And above it, on the bluff, a second town is being drawn. The Alaska Engineering Commission, the federal body charged with the railroad, lays out a planned town site on the higher ground. A survey of numbered lots and graded streets, orderly on paper, empty of people. Below it sprawls the camp that will not wait. On the same ground stand 2 settlements at once, one legal and unbuilt, the other built and illegal. The future the government intends laid directly over the men already there. The camp has no founder. No prospector struck a vein here and drew others to the strike. No trader wintered at the creek mouth and gave the place his name. No single man can be said to have made it. It was authored by a commission and a signature. A town called into being by federal decision. Its origin a route chosen at a desk, rather than a life spent on the ground. That absence is the truest fact of its making. That making produces its own small comedy of naming. In August 1915, residents hold a vote to choose what the town will be called. Alaska City wins, with 146 votes. Anchorage finishes third with 101. The count is certified, the winner declared, and it changes nothing because the Post Office Department months earlier and without consulting a single resident has already registered the settlement's post office under the name Anchorage. The town keeps the name its own people voted against. No one records a protest. No one appears to have expected otherwise. The vote, in the end, settles a matter that was never actually open. What is open? What will decide who owns this ground and who does not? Is still days away, and it has nothing to do with names. It is a question of deeds, of federal lots laid out in a grid over creek mud and stumps, and of a government surveyor about to climb onto a platform in front of a crowd and start calling numbers. Chapter 3, The Auction and the Incorporation. The surveyor's numbers are static until someone calls them aloud. And in July 1915, that duty falls to Andrew Christensen, a Danish-born federal land officer, dispatched by the General Land Office to convert the tent city's imaginary grid into private property. The land belongs to no one yet in any private sense. It is federal town site, reserved and platted for exactly this purpose, and the auction is the mechanism by which raw survey lines become deeds. Little survives of him beyond the ledger he keeps that week. No photograph reproduced often enough to be called familiar. No correspondence quoted in the histories that follow him. He mounts a platform at what is now the corner of First Avenue and C Street, above ground that 6 months earlier existed only as stakes driven into mud-flat grass, and begins to sell it. The government owns the land. Christensen's task is to turn ownership into revenue, lot by lot, bid by bid. He does not build anything. He auctions the right to build. The bidding draws a crowd that observers place at somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people, pressed into a clearing still ringed by stumps and tent canvas. Some of the bidders are the same laborers who graded track that spring. Others are merchants freighted up from Seward and Valdez, wagering that a railroad town will outlast the older ports built to supply it. By the end of the first day, buyers have committed $58,470 to lots that 6 months earlier had no market value at all. The pattern holds through the following weeks. By mid-July, 655 lots have changed hands for nearly $150,000, prices running from $25 for a marginal parcel to more than $800 for ground close to the rail yards. Men who arrived with tools now leave holding deeds, money that came north as railroad wages converting itself, parcel by parcel, into land titles. The auction does not measure the town's population. It measures its appetite. 5 years pass between that auction and the next legal transformation, and in November 1920, the residents of Anchorage vote to become something the Federal Survey alone could not make them: a city. The measure carries 328 to 130, a margin wide enough to read as consensus, narrow enough to confirm that not everyone on the flats wants the obligations that come attached to it, the taxes, the ordinances, the bonded debt. The vote converts a railroad construction camp into a municipal corporation with a mayor, a council, and the power to borrow against its own future. Incorporation is not permanence. It is paperwork, filed at a moment when the camp still believes both are coming. On paper, Anchorage becomes real in the eyes of the law. In practice, it becomes something else entirely. The census taken that same year counts 1,856 residents, a number that confirms what anyone walking the muddy grid already suspects. It is fewer people than camped on these flats in 1915 before there was a legal town to count them. The riveters leave, the rough carpenters leave, the graders who cut roadbed through Muskeg for day wages leave. Anchorage now has a charter, a council, a treasury, and fewer residents than the tent camp it replaced. The town shrinks the moment the work that summoned it approaches completion. And no one in the council chamber that November has a remedy for that arithmetic. It is the first contraction in a cycle the city will repeat across the coming century. Expansion lashed to a single project, then departure, the instant that project nears its end. The railroad itself is not finished. 3 more years of grading and bridge work stand between the coast and the interior. 3 more years before track laid north from Anchorage meets track laid south from Fairbanks, at a village called Nenana. A president will travel north to close that gap himself, driving a spike of gold into ground that has already absorbed so much iron and so much wage labor. That is still 3 years away. For now, Anchorage has a charter, nothing more. Chapter 4. The Depot That Would Not Grow. In July 1923, the president comes north. Warren G. Harding, 29th President of the United States, a former Ohio newspaper publisher and senator elevated to the presidency in 1920 on a promise of normalcy, steps off a special train at Nenana, roughly 55 miles southwest of Fairbanks, to drive the Golden Spike completing the Alaska Railroad. He is the first sitting president ever to set foot in the territory. Anchorage, still a tent and frame town of a few thousand, sits some 300 miles to the south, closer to the line's southern terminus than to the ceremony itself. The trip has been billed in Washington as the Voyage of Understanding, a tour meant to carry the president to the nation's last frontier, and back with something to say about it. Alaska is its farthest point north. It will be his last trip anywhere. At Nenana on July 15th, Harding takes the ceremonial maul and swings at the spike meant to join the northern and southern halves of the 470-mile railroad. He misses. He swings again. He misses a second time. On the third swing, the spike goes home, and the line, 6 years and roughly $65 million in the making, is, on paper, finished. No one records much fanfare beyond the swings themselves. The photograph survives. The moment does not linger. Harding does not make it back to Washington. He falls ill on the return journey down the Pacific coast, and in a San Francisco hotel room, on August 2, 1923, less than 3 weeks after the spike, he dies. He is 57. Calvin Coolidge is sworn in within hours. The nation mourns a president most Alaskans had seen only once at a railroad siding swinging a maul. The railroad, 2,000 miles from Washington, outlives the president who completed it by decades. He will never know if it works. It does not for a long while. The 1930 census counts 2,277 people in Anchorage, against 1,856 a decade before, a gain of scarcely 400 souls in 10 years for a town that now has a completed railroad running through its middle. It has the railroad. It has the depot. It has the name on the map that Congress fought over in 1915. What it does not have is a reason for anyone to come. The line hauls coal and freight, and the occasional passenger between Seward and Fairbanks, and Anchorage sits at the middle of it like a switching yard nobody meant to stay in. A supply depot, waiting for its reason. In 1935, Washington tries to manufacture that reason. The Roosevelt administration ships 203 farm families out of the failed dairy counties of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, families broken by drought and depression, and resettles them 40 miles north of Anchorage in the Matanuska Valley, at a federal cost near $5 million. Each family receives a $3,000 loan, a plot of subarctic ground, a barn, and the promise of a colony built from nothing in a valley none of them have seen. 25 of the families turn around and go home within 2 months. The rest stay and clear land and start a valley that will one day feed the region. But as policy, the colony is what the railroad was. An attempt to conjure a population by decree. Half of it takes, half of it does not. By the decade's end, Anchorage has a golden spike behind it and a half-settled farm colony beside it, and the population still will not clear 3,000. The railroad did not build the city. The New Deal did not build the city. What finally does, in the summer of 1940, arrives wearing a uniform. And it is not looking for farmland at all. Chapter 5, The War Makes a City. They come in June 1940, off transports and up the muddy grade from the depot. And they do not come to build a city. They come to build two, an airfield and a fort, and the city grows underneath them almost as an accident of scale. Fort Richardson rises east of the depot. Elmendorf Field rises beside it, runways cut into scrub spruce and permafrost. The census that year counts 3,495 people in Anchorage, more than double the number a decade before, and still, measured against what is coming, almost nothing. The railroad tried for 20 years. The colony tried for 5. The war does it in one season. The reasoning behind it is not sentimental. Japan sits closer to Alaska than to any other American possession. And by 1940, the War Department has stopped treating the territory as a frontier curiosity and started treating it as an exposed flank. Pearl Harbor confirms it a year later, in December 1941. Money follows the reasoning. Construction contracts follow the money. Anchorage, already tied to a railroad, already the depot at the center of the map, becomes the staging ground almost by elimination. Before 1942, the Aleutian chain is a defense planner's afterthought. Treeless, fog-bound, garrisoned by a few hundred men in total. Then, the flank gives. In June 1942, Japanese forces land on Attu and Kiska, at the far end of the chain, and hold them. It is the only campaign of the Second World War fought on North American soil, and it leaves the two islands as the only American territory a foreign power seizes and occupies in the 20th century. For 11 months, they stay Japanese. The Americans retake Attu in May 1943, and the fighting costs 549 dead. More than 2,000 more are taken out of action not by Japanese fire but by the cold. Frostbite, exposure, trench foot, men freezing in foxholes they cannot leave. The cold takes the toes first. The cold takes the fingers next. The cold takes, in the end, more men than the Japanese army does. It is recorded that way, flatly, without adjectives. Of the roughly 2,500 Japanese soldiers who defend Attu, fewer than 30 survive to be taken prisoner. The garrison's last men, out of ammunition and out of options, form for one of the largest banzai charges of the entire war, driving into the American line before dawn in a single mass assault. It ends the battle, and very nearly ends itself. By the second week of May, Attu is American again. Kiska falls 3 months later without a fight. The Japanese garrison has already withdrawn under fog before the invasion lands. The chain is secure. None of this happens in Anchorage. All of it is paid for there. The town, well over 1,000 kilometers from Attu, becomes rear base and switching yard for the entire Aleutian theater. The depot the railroad built now moving troops, fuel, and freight north and west at a volume it has never handled before and will not stop handling for the rest of the war. Construction crews who came to build one fort stay to build 3 more. The population Anchorage could not generate in 20 years of homesteading bills and colony subsidies, the war generates in 36 months. Payrolls swell. Barracks multiply. The war itself ends in August 1945 on the deck of a ship in a different ocean. But the reasoning that built Fort Richardson does not end with it. A base raised to watch Japan turns almost without pause, to watch the Soviet Union instead, whose own territory begins less than 1,000 kilometers from Nome. On the shortest line, a bomber can fly. That line will have a name soon enough, the Great Circle Route. For now, it is only a fact of the globe. Someone is about to notice it. Chapter 6, The Garrison on the Great Circle. Someone in Washington finally traces the line. Flatten the globe onto a map, and the Soviet Union sits an ocean and a continent from Seattle. Remote. Manageable. Curve the globe back into a sphere, and run the shortest path from Murmansk or Vladivostok toward the industrial cities of the American West, and the line no longer crosses an ocean. It crosses the pole, it crosses Alaska, low over the Bering Sea and the Chugach, and a rail depot that 15 years earlier was tents in the mud. The Great Circle route that had been only a fact of the globe a few years earlier becomes, by 1947, a fact Washington cannot unlearn. In 1947, the Army and the Air Force fold their Alaska commands into a single structure, Alaskan Command, seated at Elmendorf. The money follows the reorganization. Over the next 10 years, 1947 to 1957, the military pours $1.2 billion into construction across the territory. Runways lengthened for jet bombers, radar stations strung along the coast, housing built for families, rather than for a campaign that will end. The military builds the runways. The military builds the radar towers, a picket line against an enemy that never lands. The military builds the barracks and the mess halls and the family quarters, on the theory that a soldier with a wife and children does not leave. The site does not close. By the mid-1950s, the arithmetic of the town has narrowed to a single client. Alaska's economy runs to roughly $500 million a year, and about $350 million of it, $7.10, traces back to military payrolls, military contracts, military construction. Fishing and fur, gold and timber, the industries that built the territory's first fortunes, are rounding errors beside one customer in uniform. Anchorage is not a diversified economy, it is a company town, and the company is the Department of Defense. The census absorbs the money as population. In 1950, the town counts 11,254 residents, already more than triple the 3,495 counted a decade earlier, at the edge of the war. By 1960, the count reaches 44,397, a near quadrupling in 10 years, in a city with no deep-water port worth the name and a climate that punishes ambition. Streets are platted faster than they can be paved. Schools are built and outgrown before the paint dries. The boom outruns the city plan. Picture 4th Avenue on a November night in 1957. Neon runs over the bars and a movie marquee, the light thrown flat across packed snow and cinder. Servicemen in dress uniform move between doorways in loose lines, on leave from Elmendorf and Fort Richardson, money in their pockets that did not exist in this town 15 years before. Overhead, transports and fighters cross low on approach, engine noise folding into the general noise of the street, so constant that no one below looks up anymore. Past the last row of buildings, the Chugach stand black against a sky the neon cannot reach. 15 years earlier, this was tents, mud, and a few thousand people. It never chose this size. Every light on that street, every engine overhead, every dollar spent in every doorway traces back through a single line item in a federal budget written 2,000 miles away. The town has not built an economy of its own. It is renting one, a garrison capital living entirely on the credit of a single tenant, one appropriation cycle at a time. The garrison city is confident in its growth curve and confident in its concrete, but it has spent no attention on what lies beneath either. Landfill in some quarters, marine clay in others, ground never asked to bear this much weight before. Money keeps arriving, people keep arriving, runways keep extending, and the census keeps climbing, past 44,397 toward a figure no one in 1957 bothers to guess. None of it accounts for what the ground itself is doing, quietly, under the frost. The city has 7 years left before the afternoon that finds out. It does not know the countdown has started. Chapter 7. Good Friday. The countdown ends on a Friday. March 27th, 1964, 5:36 in the evening. The stores on 4th Avenue closing early for the holiday, the streets thinning toward supper. The ground beneath south-central Alaska begins to move and does not stop. It moves for roughly 4.5 minutes, a magnitude of 9.2, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America, the second most powerful ever recorded on Earth. Only the Chile earthquake of 1960 measured larger since instruments began keeping score. 4.5 minutes is not a metaphor. It is the length of time the men who built this city on 4 separate promises now spend on their knees, or under door frames, or watching the pavement open like water. 4th Avenue drops more than 10 feet. The same 4th Avenue that carried the neon of the Garrison years, the bars, and the jukeboxes, and the boomtown light. That street slides toward the inlet in sections, storefronts sinking below the curb line of the block behind them, as if the city had been resting all along on something that had simply changed its mind. The clay under Anchorage, the bootlegger Cove clay, buried and unnamed through 40 years of railroad surveys and Army engineering reports, turns to liquid under the shaking and carries the ground with it. What the founders never asked about the soil now answers. At the J.C. Penney building, precast concrete panels tear loose from the facade and fall into the street below. Mary Louise Rustigan is shopping when the panels come down. Lee Steyer is 18, a student, and does not leave the sidewalk. Both are killed by concrete that had been bolted to a wall an hour earlier. Government Hill Elementary School is broken into jagged sections, the playground split by a fissure running through where the swings had been. The building empty only because the school day had already ended and the children had already gone home. The clock spared them. Nothing else did. In Turnagain Heights, the bluff above Cook Inlet does what the clay beneath it has been capable of doing since before the city existed. It liquefies, and 75 homes ride the collapsing ground toward the water below. Entire foundations traveling hundreds of feet in blocks, trees still upright, telephone poles still standing, houses arriving at the bottom of the slide with their furniture unmoved inside them. 2 brothers are lost in Turnagain Heights that evening, 12 years old and 2 years old, when the earth opens beneath their house and closes again. Their bodies are never recovered. They are logged still as missing. The shaking itself kills relatively few. Of about 131 dead across the state, only around 9 die from the earthquake directly. The rest are killed by water. The quake generates tsunamis that radiate outward from the source for hours, and it is the water, not the ground, that empties whole communities. In the village of Chenega, a wave arrives with almost no warning and takes 23 of the village's 68 residents, 12 of them children, leaving the schoolhouse standing alone on its hill above a shoreline that no longer resembles the one from that morning. The waves kill in Valdez. They kill in Seward. They travel down the coast and kill in Crescent City, California, and along the Oregon shore, more than 1,500 miles from where the ground first moved. Property damage runs into the hundreds of millions of 1964 dollars. By morning, the shaking has stopped. The water has receded. And Anchorage begins doing what it has done 3 times before, counting what is left and building again on top of it. Government contracts move in for the reconstruction the way military contracts once moved in for the garrison. 4th Avenue is regraded, its stores rebuilt a few feet higher than the street that swallowed them. The city does not relocate. It does not abandon the clay. It repaves it. And 650 miles to the north, underground that no seismograph is watching and no engineer has yet drilled, something is waiting that has nothing to do with earthquakes at all, something that will not announce itself for 4 more years, and that will build this city a 3rd time. Chapter 8. The Field of Oil. In January 1968, geologists working for Atlantic Richfield and Humble Oil confirm what seismic surveys have hinted at for months. Beneath the tundra of the North Slope lies an oil field of a size North America has not seen before. Prudhoe Bay holds an estimated 25 billion barrels of oil in place, a figure so large that the industry itself takes years to fully believe it. The field sits 650 miles north of Anchorage, above the Arctic Circle, on permafrost that will not thaw for the convenience of a rig crew. No pipeline exists to move the oil south. No port waits to load it. For now, the wealth of Prudhoe Bay is a number in a well log, 650 miles from the nearest bank that might finance pulling it out of the ground. Anchorage does not sit on the oil. It never has. What Anchorage sits on is the address, the airport that can land the jets, the office floors that can hold the lawyers, the banks that can carry the loans. The city has done this before. First, the railroad needs a headquarters, and Anchorage becomes a railroad town. Then the garrison needs a headquarters, and Anchorage becomes a garrison town. Now the oil needs a headquarters, and Anchorage becomes an oil town. Corporate capital of a resource it will never touch, host to a wealth that is always by 650 miles somewhere else. Getting the oil out takes years of engineering and litigation before a single valve turns. Construction on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline runs from 1974 to 1977, 800 miles of steel from Prudhoe Bay to the ice-free port of Valdez. It costs $8 billion to build, and at its peak, the project carries more than 28,000 workers on the line. Welders, truckers, camp cooks, pipe fitters, spread across a state that a few years earlier counted barely 300,000 residents. Anchorage supplies the payroll office and the paperwork. The tundra supplies the labor. Oil first moves through the finished line in June 1977. On the slope, a welder can clear more than $1,000 a week. A truck driver hauling gravel on the haul road can do the same. The wages do not stay on the slope. They come south, on the same planes that carried the crews north, and they land in Anchorage, in car lots, in bars, in down payments on houses and subdivisions that did not exist 2 winters before. The pipeline is finished. The money is only beginning to move. The arithmetic of the boom is not subtle. Statewide payroll employment doubles from roughly 40,000 jobs to 80,000 between 1970 and 1975. Private sector employment doubles again in the opening years of the 1980s. More than 36,000 homes go up across urban Alaska inside 5 years. Whole subdivisions framed and roofed before the first snow. A city that spent 1965 counting its dead spends 1978 unable to build fast enough to house the living. Carpenters commute in from as far as the Kenai Peninsula. Lumber sells before the truck finishes unloading it. The skyline keeps the boom's ledger the way tree rings keep a season's rainfall. The Arco Tower rises downtown in 1983, glass and steel over streets that 30 years earlier were gravel. The BP building follows in 1985. $50 million of concrete and tinted window, a monument to a company whose wells are 650 miles north and whose headquarters, for the moment, is here. In 1976, with the pipeline still unfinished, the state creates the Alaska Permanent Fund, setting aside a share of oil revenue against a future when the wells run dry or the price falls. In 1982, it pays its first dividend, $1,000 to every eligible resident, a check drawn on oil already spoken for twice over. By the middle of the 1980s, Anchorage stands as a city built 3 times over, by rail, by war, by oil, and richer on paper than it has ever been. The towers keep climbing, the dividend checks keep arriving, but the entire structure, the loans, the payrolls, the $50 million buildings, rests on a single number that no one in Anchorage controls, the price of a barrel of oil, set not on the North Slope and not on 4th Avenue, but on a trading floor thousands of miles away. In 1986, that number moves. Chapter 9. The Price of a Barrel. And then, in 1986, the price of oil falls below $10 a barrel. Nothing in Anchorage changes that week. The Arco Tower still holds its offices. The BP building, finished the year before for $50 million, still catches the morning light on its glass face. Construction crews still report to sites half-finished the previous winter. But the number that no one in the city controls has moved. and every ledger in Anchorage was written against the assumption that it would not. The pipeline still carries 1 million barrels a day south to Valdez. It no longer matters what the pipeline carries. What matters is what each barrel is worth, and that figure has been cut by more than half. The real estate market is the first to register it. Land and homes bought on the expectation of a permanent oil price lose more than half their value within months. Buyers who signed mortgages in 1983, in 1984, in 1985 discover that the collateral beneath their loans is worth less than the loan itself. By the end of 1987, 14,000 homes in Anchorage stand empty. Streets built for the doubling population of the boom years now hold driveways with no cars, windows with no lights, yards going to seed against the mountains. The foreclosures follow. Statewide, in numbers, the banks had not modeled. More than 30,000 foreclosure filings move through Alaska's courts before the decade ends. The banks that wrote the loans begin to fail. Roughly 8 of them close, close to 40% of every bank chartered in the state. And among the names that disappear from Anchorage's skyline of signage are Alaska Mutual and United Bank Alaska, institutions that had financed the second oil tower, the third subdivision, the fourth hotel, ceased to exist within a matter of months. What a boom brings in, a bust removes at the same speed. It removed the population after the railroad stalled. It removed the population after the war contracts lapsed. It removes the population now, faster than either time before because there are more people in Anchorage to lose. Roughly 40,000 residents leave the state between 1986 and 1989. The city that oil built empties out nearly as fast as it filled. They leave the way people leave a company town when the company falters, unit by unit, family by family, moving vans parked outside houses, still carrying for sale signs from the year before. The construction crews go first because there is nothing left to build. The bank employees go next because there are no banks left to employ them. The oil workers go last because oil is still coming out of Prudhoe Bay. Only now it buys less and pays for less and supports fewer of the towers built to answer it. The price of a barrel recovers in time, though not to where it stood before. Anchorage recovers with it, in fragments, unevenly, never quite reassembling into the city the boom had promised. The offices refill slowly. The 14,000 empty homes find owners again over years, not months. What is left when the recovery settles is not the city of 1985. It is something smaller, warier, built on the memory of what a single number, moved once, can undo. That inventory, what oil left behind, what 4 booms built and 4 busts unbuilt, is what remains to be counted. Chapter 10. What the Tide Returns. Anchorage today holds close to 289,000 people, still the largest city in Alaska, still nearly 40% of the state's population inside one municipal boundary. For 7 straight years, into the early 2020s, it lost residents. Most of the state's shrinking working-age population left from here first. In a single count taken in 2023, 1,760 people in Anchorage had no home to return to that night. The cost of living runs well above the national average, in a city that was built to extract wealth, not to hold on to it. North Slope oil peaked at more than 2 million barrels a day in 1988. By 2020, it had fallen to 448,000 barrels a day, the lowest output since 1976, more than 75% below the peak that once seemed permanent. Oil paid 90% of the state budget in the years the pipeline ran full. It pays closer to 23% now. The difference is covered by the permanent fund, the account built from the boom's own royalties, set aside by men who assumed the boom would end. The money the oil made now pays for the state the oil itself can no longer afford. Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport sits on the same Great Circle route the interceptor pilots once scrambled to defend, the shortest line between Asia and North America. The fact of geography that made this city necessary before it made it rich. It is now one of the busiest cargo airports on Earth. Almost none of that cargo is bound for Anchorage. It lands, it refuels, it transfers, it leaves. The same arrangement the Cold War left behind, minus the war, minus the pretense that any of it was ever really about the city underneath the flight path. Where the bluff gave way in the March dark of 1964 and carried 75 homes into Cook Inlet, there is a park now, named for the earthquake that made it. A gravel loop runs through birch that has grown up over ground that was never rebuilt. Nothing marks what is buried beneath it. Downtown, the BP Tower, $50 million raised in the boom year of 1985, stands mostly empty, its floors leased out in fragments or not leased at all, a glass ledger kept by a company that has mostly gone home. A city assembled from a railroad, a war, and a field of oil, each of them spent in turn. Is the American frontier compressed into one place? A boom is a loan the future is expected to repay. Turnagain Arm does not know any of this. Twice a day, the water still climbs 40 feet up the inlet, the same water that once told a Russian captain, and later an American general, that a port could be built here and held. It crosses the mudflats where the tent city stood through the winter of 1915, where the men who would lay the railroad slept before there was a railroad to lay. It comes in as a single wall, visible for miles before it reaches anything, moving upstream against a current that cannot stop it. It does not slow at the airport fence. It does not slow at the empty tower or the gravel loop through Earthquake Park. It was here before the railroad. It was here before the war. It was here before the oil. Then, twice a day, it goes.